Good morning and welcome to our town hall on hurricane safety. Hurricane season is now well underway, and we've got a panel of three local experts who are going to give out advice on how to respond in the event of a hurricane, how to respond afterward, and we'll also go through some of the forecasts for this hurricane season. But first, let's start with an ad from our sponsor, the AARP.
AARP Louisiana is honored to sponsor today's town hall with The Advocate. I'm Alfred Mason, AARP Louisiana Volunteer State President. Just like many of you across the state, I know what it's like to lose your home to a natural disaster like a hurricane. That's why I'm dedicated and passionate about educating others on disaster preparedness, and so is AARP Louisiana. AARP Louisiana continues to connect you with information and resources like today's town hall. And during last year's legislative session, AARP fought for better emergency planning at nursing homes and independent living facilities. We also fought for improved responses from our state and federal agencies. That's what we do at AARP Louisiana. To learn more and to get involved, visit
Okay, so thanks for joining us. I'm Mike Smith. I'm the environmental editor at the Times-Picayune and the Advocate. And so we're going to go through a list of advice and preparation notes for this hurricane season. So first, let me introduce our panelists today. First is Ruby Douglas. She is the Preparedness Section Chief in the Emergency Management Division for the Governor's Office of Homeland Security and Emergency Preparedness. She's responsible for networking and providing resources and information to various state, federal, and local agencies and organizations. She's been awarded and recognized for her extensive contributions to the state's responses to various disasters, ranging from COVID to hurricanes and floods. Second, we have Colin Arnold. He is the director of the Office of Homeland Security and Emergency Preparedness for the city of New Orleans. He's worked for the city for over 24 years, first with the New Orleans Police Department, then operations and emergency management at Louis Armstrong New Orleans International Airport, and for over the last decade in NOSEP. He was appointed director by Mayor Cantrell in May 2018. And then we have Chris Franklin, who is the chief meteorologist for WWL TV in New Orleans, with nearly 2 decades of weather forecasting experience in the city. He began his broadcast career in Topeka, Kansas, and after a year of chasing tornadoes and driving through blizzards, he returned to New Orleans just before Hurricane Katrina struck the coast. He's covered a wide range of major weather events during that time and won several awards from the Press Club of New Orleans and the Louisiana Association of Broadcasters. So thank you all for joining us today. I thought we'd start with Chris, who can kind of give us an overview of the forecast so far for this season. We've had, on the one hand, it seems we've had some competing factors, some factors that seem to make for a sort of average season, but then others which would seem to make it an above average season. And so I'd be interested to find out where that leaves us. So Chris, maybe if you could give us a little bit of background on all of that.
Yeah, well, the seasonal forecast, again, as I tell viewers all the time, you take those with a grain of salt, because whether they're forecasting an above average, below average, near average, for all intents and purposes, you always prepare exactly the same, no matter what we are anticipating. And even a above average season, if nothing gets in the Gulf or threatens the northern Gulf Coast, for us, it was quiet. And on the reverse, if it was a below average season, but we get pounded, then for us, it was active. So you kind of treat those seasonal forecasts with a grain of salt. And it also tells you nothing about where a storm may go or what those impacts may be. So with that in mind, we kind of take each storm individually as opposed to looking at the whole season. But with the seasonal forecast, you're right. There were a couple of competing factors that were making it a little bit more difficult for those that forecast these seasonal outlooks to know which one was going to win out. For the one hand, we are in a very strong El Nino period. And for the tropics, what that does is it increases wind shear across what is called the main development region of the Atlantic, kind of as you go across the Caribbean through the Atlantic toward West Africa, you have enhanced wind shear. What wind shear does is it is increasing winds with height. That rips apart thunderstorms. So as they try and grow and develop, they get the tops ripped off of them. So nothing is really able to develop. Not that anything can't, but it's more of a struggle. And that usually hinders the amount of development that you see in that main development region of the Atlantic. On the opposite, we have above normal sea surface temperatures. In fact, some of them are record-breaking sea surface temperatures, which would enhance development as storms move over this incredibly warm water that would normally allow these storms to explode. Doesn't necessarily mean it will, but they could do that. So you had kind of these two competing factors with regards to the seasonal forecast. The early forecasts, as these folks are looking at it, even in the springtime, Colorado State, one of the more famous, since they kind of spearheaded this, in April and even in June, when they issue their initial forecast, they were calling for us to be either just below or right around an average season based on the strength of El Nino. Well, now we've already had 4 named storms, 1 unnamed that happened in January, but 4 during the season so far. And that puts us kind of ahead of schedule as with regards to if this was going to be a normal season, we normally would not have already had 4 named storms and 1 hurricane. Don was a hurricane in the Atlantic. And so because of that, they decided to increase their number. So now they're calling for near normal to just above normal. This doesn't look to be a hyperactive season, but looking at it to be maybe above normal. So again, with that said, that doesn't tell you anything about what we might see impacting the Gulf of Mexico, or if we were to see anything in the Gulf of Mexico, what those impacts would be. So those seasonal forecasts may be just kind of an initial guidance of what we could anticipate for the season as a whole, but it tells us nothing about certain regions of the country or certain regions of the Atlantic Basin and where we could see that activity. So the way it stands right now, we are looking at it to stay above average or maybe right near average. An average season would be 14 named storms, 7 hurricanes, and 3 major. What they're forecasting now is 18, 9, and 4. So a little above those climatological averages over the last 30 years. So with that said, and an El Nino, which would hinder the development in the main development region of the Atlantic, that doesn't do anything for the Gulf of Mexico. We don't see enhanced wind shear in the Gulf because of El Nino. So, and I always stress this at talks and to viewers when we're discussing the tropics, is that my worry is always those homegrown storms, the ones that form in the Gulf or right off the coast of Florida, in the Atlantic, near the Bahamas, because when those develop, you don't have a whole lot of lead time. It's only a few days. And again, as far as El Nino goes and the seasonal forecast, it doesn't really impact the Gulf of Mexico. And those are the storms that I'm more concerned about because you don't get that big lead time.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. And yeah, as everybody says, it only takes one. I think that's a great point. And then, and you sort of touched on the rapid intensification, which happens in the Gulf, which maybe we can try to touch on a bit later if there's time. But yeah, I suspect Ruby and Colin would probably agree that that doesn't change their preparations very much, the forecast, I mean, because you always have to prepare no matter what. But maybe, Ruby, if you could start with discussing that a little bit, and then you know, what are some of your top advice in terms of preparation, and is there anything new this year in terms of the state?
Well, I'll just tell you, I know everybody's used to the first 72 LMU, and we want to make sure that folks do make sure that they are preparing and have their family readiness plans together, as well as their emergency preparedness kits. However, you know, as Chris says, you know, it only takes one, and we want folks to be weather aware. You know, definitely hurricanes is our #1 threat in coastal Louisiana, but we have seen Mother Nature really have a wrath to our state. We've had severe weather, increased temperatures across the state, excessive heat warnings, which can actually lend itself to severe weather and even tornadoes. And so we want folks to be weather aware. We've gotten very good at using science to make forecasts and to make sure that communication is there. So I would just say, you know, be mindful of the last events that we've had. We've had critical infrastructures go down. And even when we say the first 72 LMU, it's taken us a little while to get that power restored. And so our best advice is to make sure when you're building your family readiness plan, it's good to make sure that you evacuate where you and your family can be comfortable. We don't want folks to actually have to wait until the very last minute to kind of get out of harm's way. I'll just tell you, Mike, for me, the 36 hours after AC, I'm a little hangry. And so if you want to be comfortable, it'd be best for you to go ahead and plan ahead. So that's the best advice I would actually tell our listeners to do that, is because we know even hurricanes, that's significant, but also flooding can cause some major issues with heavy rain. And so I'll just pitch this back to Colin because I know he's been around a long time, and he also has a great grasp on what New Orleans area needs to do as well.
Yeah, thanks, Ruby. Yeah, Colin, if you want to touch on some of those issues, both in terms of kind of your top tips for preparation, and we can get into some specifics about evacuation later, but maybe generally some thoughts on evacuation.
No, good morning, and I apologize. I'm actually doing some work out in New Orleans East with the marsh fire, which we hope to have under control today. So that's a whole other thing that's going on right now. But I really appreciate the opportunity to be here. Chris and Ruby both nailed it. My view on El Nino is that it does have clearly the potential to assist us with the more the hurricanes that form out in the Atlantic. But we're looking at seawater temperatures in the Gulf that are just crazy right now, and so I am very concerned about the rapid intensification, short notice storms. So I think our big message this year is we're really drilling down on protecting vulnerable populations. We've created ordinance that requires many of these facilities that hadn't had to kind of have a plan before to have a plan and be ready. And that includes evacuating or us assisting with evacuation or moving them if necessary. And then I think the main message we want to send this year clearly is you have to stay connected. Staying connected through media outlets like yourselves, like WWL TV, WWL Radio, all of the others. But then also, our NOLA Ready platform is something that we're really promoting in order to, get people to get the message quickly. Having a plan, having your supplies ready, whether it be shelter in place or whether it be evacuation, making that evacuation decision on your own, regardless of where government might be at that moment, because there's a lot of things. We've seen a lot about contraflow this year and other things that, we're all working on adapting our plans to try and shorten the timeline, but in some cases that's just not possible. And so people need to take action, the action that they need to protect themselves, their family members, their friends, their neighbors. And we're going to do the same, trying to particularly focus on vulnerable populations like seniors, like those with mobility and medical issues that may need more assistance than others getting through a storm.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Colin. I think one of the big issues that people in this area kind of grapple with when a storm may or may not be approaching is kind of, okay, when do we make decisions about whether to evacuate? Where should we go? Which highways should we attempt to drive on without getting stuck in a parking lot for hours and hours, which may not be avoidable in a lot of cases. But maybe, Ruby, if you could start with that. When do you think people should start deciding whether to leave, at what point before a storm, and which direction should they head? Should they rely on contraflow, which I think a lot of people still think they can, but that's not necessarily the case from what I understand.
No, I'll just tell you, I wish I could actually coin it, because it really should be go before contraflow, because contraflow really is the last resort. And you got to understand it takes a lot of state assets and a lot of coordination with not just our state and local partners, but also other states, because we actually have to do an agreement when that is called. The parish president is the one that actually issues that, and it has to be done in a certain timeline. As Colin said, it's kind of concerning when you talk about rapid intensification or no notice storms, because we can't have buses on those highways when there's tropical storm winds that actually may affect safety there. So I would definitely say go before contraflow. Make sure that you are keeping alert to weather aware through local news stations as well as your local officials. When you have something out in the Gulf, I mean, we know that we had less than a certain amount of time frame when Ida even hit, and so it's important for us to be mindful of that. As it relates to contraflow or even construction, I would just say your best route is to go up north. I know everybody's got GPS and Waze and Google Maps, but it might be good for you to look at road maps to see what goes on. I know the Department of Transportation and Development has its www.511la.org, and you can actually look at road constructions. You could also look at cameras of evacuation. But anybody that's actually even been in any kind of road construction or even road congestion, you want to go before it's a parking lot. And so just think about the family members that may have 5 kids and a dog. You don't want to be standing 6 hours before you even hit the roadway to get out of harm's way. So I would just say your local weather forecasters and your local officials are going to give you the best information you can have to make those informed decisions for your family.
Yeah, absolutely. That's all good advice. And as you mentioned, sort of paying attention to local media and local government alerts. So maybe Chris, if you could kind of go through a bit of, I know that the forecasting technology has improved a lot in recent years, but maybe you can describe some of the advantages of that, but also the shortcomings. Obviously, you can't know everything. So
We try, but we can't.
right. So maybe you can explain to people a bit of, how certain you can be and how uncertain you can be also.
Well, yeah, I will start with, I've been doing this professionally for almost 20 years now, and it is incredible how much in that short period of time the forecast technology has changed for the better. We are far more accurate with these forecasts than ever before. There was a time when I first got started that there was kind of an unwritten rule of thumb that when that first forecast cone came out, you wanted to be right in the center because chances are you were not going to be by the time the storm actually made landfall. So, not that long ago when that initial cone, you wanted to be right in the center of that. Now, when that cone comes out, you don't see it very, very much at all. That just goes to show you the incredible skill now of the models, but also the forecasters, the official forecast from the National Hurricane Center. That's what we show when we show that cone. That is coming from the forecasters at the Hurricane Center. People will ask, well, which model do you use? Which model is better? There, I might have lost you for a second there. Hope I'm still on. Some folks I was getting so excited about the models. The folks will ask what model is better, which one works better, which one are you using? The models don't compare to what the National Hurricane Center folks produce. Their forecast is far more accurate than any one given model. So when folks ask, what are you using? I'm looking at what the folks at the Hurricane Center are saying. So their forecast skill and all the models as well have done incredibly well in recent years. So when those initial forecasts come out, you're probably not going to see a great deal of change with regards to where that cone is going and when those initial forecasts start coming out for these storms. The big problem, though, and something we've all been really harping more on, is that the storms that develop in the Gulf or just off the Atlantic coast, off of Florida, is that you don't get that massive lead time that a lot of folks think they're going to get with these storms. There was a really interesting stat from the Hurricane Center. I went to one of their conferences last year, and of all the strongest landfalling hurricanes in the United States, so that's 150 miles per hour or greater, all but one were only tropical storms 3 days before landfall. So almost all of those storms 3 days out, which usually is kind of that magic number with evacuations, they were still just tropical storms. And I don't know too many people that would start making a plan to evacuate when a storm is only a tropical storm. And I hate to say only, because even a tropical storm can do some damage. But I think if folks' mindset is, if it's just a tropical storm or it's just a 1 or a 2, I'm not going to evacuate for it, and I still have plenty of time to leave. Well, we've seen in history now that these storms don't give you a whole lot of lead time, and they tend to be very weak just a few days prior to making landfall, Ida included. We didn't have that massive lead time that I think a lot of folks assume they're going to have. And so something that we've discussed in the Weather Center at WWL is, do we think people maybe heed these warnings when they see the computer models come out that, yes, it's just a tropical wave, or it's just a depression right now, or it's just a storm right now, but we are expecting within 2 days, this is going to be a major hurricane. So we don't know if when we stress that this is what we are expecting it to become, or is it, the folks need to see this monster storm in the Gulf of Mexico to make their decision? Well, once you have the monster storm in the Gulf of Mexico, that decision time that window to leave is very, very small. So our technology is great. We can give you that lead time. Sometimes that lead time may only be a couple of days, only because these storms rapidly intensify in the Gulf of Mexico, and you don't get these days heads up, or it's not necessarily a storm that comes off of Africa and we've been tracking it for near 2 weeks, and you've got plenty of time. You've made all your arrangements ahead of time and everything's ready to go. You may only get a couple of days advance notice. And to be honest, as the technology has improved, there's a lot of talk in some circles with computer modeling that we may be kind of reaching the peak of our computer model skill, that we might not see the models get much better than they are right now, because I tell you what, they're pretty accurate as things stand right now, and it may be difficult to get them even more accurate in the near future, even long-term future.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, and some of that stuff is just so super interesting when you read about the hurricane hunters flying into the storms and feeding that data into the hurricane centers, algorithms or whatever they use to come up with a forecast. It's all fascinating stuff, and I guess and obviously helps us, but as you mentioned, we're gonna hit a limit at some point, I suppose, and then the rest is up to Mother Nature. Sorry, you're on mute, Chris.
There is that skill in the track forecast, which is very, very accurate. And a lot of folks critique the fact that the intensity forecast doesn't always seem as though we're quite as accurate. And that is true. And it's thanks to the hurricane hunters. And now we have sail drones that go out and are actually measuring data at the surface of the water. The inner workings of a hurricane make it vastly more difficult to forecast what the storm itself is going to do with regards to the intensity. That is always going to be the most difficult forecast to figure out, is the intensity forecast. That's always going to be the struggle. All of the surrounding steering currents, we can sample much, much more accurately and get a much better idea with regards to the track. So the track forecast is always going to be better than the intensity forecast. And one of the reasons why we always put that caveat when we're showing the forecast from the Hurricane Center is that it may be showing a 3 or so at landfall. My inclination is always to tell viewers, assume it is going to be a 4. Maybe it's a category weaker, but err on the side of caution and assume it's going to be 1 category stronger than that, because that intensity forecast is so difficult to nail down.
Yeah, absolutely. And more reason to pay attention to these forecasts as they change moving forward, because they can change so quickly. So just note that Colin had to step out for a second. He should be back soon. But Ruby, given all of that, on the evacuation, the sheltering situation is what I wanted to ask you about. I know this is mostly up to the local authorities, the cities and the parishes to organize. But the state does play a role. We do have the mega shelter and I believe some other programs, some busing, maybe, I guess. Maybe if you could describe what are the sheltering options? What should people rely on those, or should you make other plans, or what's the strategy behind sheltering, and
Well, we
what's
definitely,
available?
yeah. And as emergency managers, our first priority is to make sure that we protect lives above all things and get people out of harm's way. All the parish office of emergency management, like Colin and his counterparts across the state, they should have a shelter of last resort. But we do know, and even going back to what Chris talked about, I'll look at also the modeling is a good thing too, but you also need to be looking at the data. The past 3 years, we've been impacted, and we had 7 presidential declarations where half the state, during Laura Delta, there was 21 parishes impacted, and on Ida, there was 25 parishes impacted. So it's very clear to me when we talk about sheltering, those folks that need to get a hard way first, do you have friends and family to go to? Because when we talk about sheltering, it's a lifeboat, it's not a yacht. And so even when we have to open up the mega shelter, I want you to think about being there with everybody on that Mardi Gras parade route. That's a lot of people in a shelter. So first of all, friends and family should foremost be the first option there if you can make that happen. Red Cross is a great mass care partner for us, and the Department of Children and Family Services actually helps support and coordinate the mega shelter and those state shelters. We also have parish point-to-point operations where buses actually are impacted, and they provide those folks with critical transportation needs shelter to another neighboring parish, so that way that those citizens can be sheltered in North Louisiana. And so it takes a lot of coordination, a lot of resources to make that happen. So I would just tell you, it's important to make sure that you kind of understand that process. What makes your family more comfortable if you need to kind of evacuate? Because as we said, we talk about the first 72 on you, and we also know from the past storms that some of those sheltering operations lasted a little bit longer than expected, and that makes it a long day. I don't know, Mike, if you've ever had people evacuate to your house, but I have, and sometimes, I'm a good social worker for the first 2 days, and then that third day, I'm probably a little kind of frustrated because everybody likes their own space. And so you want to make sure that you are planning in accordance with that. But the mega shelter, and as well as the point-to-point operations, the state has worked with all partners to make sure that is a reality to support those needs.
And are there parameters for when you would decide to open the mega? It's only for a major storm, I guess, where you all would usually do that.
Yes. It's really actually as a part of that. We're monitoring that. And if there's an incident, I know Chris and his team is probably looking at the forecast too, but at the state level, we're monitoring it too to see what kind of trickle points are needed so we can kind of execute other plans and operations to support the state and its citizens.
Yeah. Okay. And just to touch on the contraflow issue again, because I think there's a lot of confusion surrounding that, and this might be more of a question for DOTD, but maybe Ruby, if you can comment on it. But the way I understand it is basically a decision to employ contraflow must be done, I think, 72 hours in advance of contraflow, which means you have to, because roads have to be closed and rerouted, traffic lights have to be redirected, neighboring states have to be notified, exits have to be closed off. It's a really complicated operation. And then you have to leave enough time at the end of it to go and change all those things back in a sense, and pick up all the roadblocks and all those sorts of things, because the winds will blow it all away. So I think that's kind of part of the reason why the state is not telling people, look, you're not going to be able to rely on that. And I don't think it's been used in a number of years, but is that basically it, Ruby?
Yeah, you actually hit the nail on the head right there, Mike. I think actually when people think of contraflow, they're looking at contraflow in terms of the definition to actually expedite people out of a concert area or expedite people out of a sporting event. Contraflow is a part of hurricane evacuation. It's more complicated than that because we have to have other safety parameters and other decision points that need to be made before that is called. And so citizens need to understand if in a hurricane situation, you need to go before contraflow is actually called. Because of the fact that, we need to make sure that those buses have the ability to kind of get there and get through the traffic and make sure that they're not hindered by any kind of storm impact based on wind.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And so, Chris, you mentioned a little bit about, these storms rapidly intensifying, going from tropical storm to powerful hurricane in a few days or whatever, once they hit the Gulf. Is that happening more now? Is it simply because of the warmer waters, or maybe you could describe a little bit about why that happens?
The rapid intensification process is something that is still being researched by some of the experts in those type of fields, where we're trying to figure out why this occurs and why sometimes it doesn't. I think one of the first times we really heard about it was Katrina, and there was a lot of emphasis on the loop current, which is a pool in the central. It kind of migrates a bit, but it's generally in the southern or central Gulf of Mexico, and it's a pool of very warm, very deep water. So even as what is called upwelling, as the storms start churning that water, it tends to churn up colder water from underneath, and that can actually start to kill a storm when they remain almost stationary out over the ocean. They start churning up colder water. That water temperature at the surface begins to drop, and that will actually help to weaken a storm. With a loop current, it's a pool of very deep warm water. So as it churns that water, it is still churning up warm water to sustain itself. What's interesting about the Katrina year in 2005, there were 6 storms that passed directly over the loop current, Katrina being one. 3 of the storms rapidly intensified, moving over the loop current. 3 of the storms did not. We look back at even storms after the Katrina year. Gustav moved over the loop current. It didn't explode in strength. And there have been other storms that move over that pool of very deep water and do not explode in strength. So the rapid intensification, I don't know if it's happening more often. I believe it's now something that we're more aware of because our technology has improved such. There's also a paper that is out by the Hurricane Center where a lot of folks in the public think we're now seeing more storms than ever before. That really isn't the case either. It's because our technology has gotten so much better. We're able to see even the slightest circulation or closed rotation of a tropical wave in order to now declare those tropical storms, hurricanes, and whatnot. And so we're able to detect them much sooner and much farther out than ever before. So it really, we're almost, the technology is a double-edged sword. We're able to find these storms earlier and more frequently now, but it also appears that we're getting an influx or an explosion in the number of storms. And it really is just because our technology has gotten so much better over the years that we're able to see these. And it's the same with the rapid intensification. We're just able to see these occurring now and able to kind of analyze these a little bit better than before. So the idea that we're seeing more of the rapid intensification isn't quite true. I think it's just because our technology has gotten to the point where we're able to better analyze these storms kind of exploding in strength. And from what the early research can tell, it's a number of factors, but it's almost the storms move into kind of the prime environment with warm water, ample room in the atmosphere to grow and just kind of explode in strength. And it usually involves the steering currents around the storm. You need to get an upper high where you get an exhaust, almost like an exhaust fan for these storms, where as they grow into the atmosphere, those taller cloud tops are able to be removed from the center of the storm in order for more storms to continue to grow. And so it's kind of almost a perfect storm type environment that needs to be set up for these storms to rapidly intensify. And the research that's being done right now is, can computer models possibly see this type of situation and maybe this type of an environment that a storm is moving into that would possibly allow for the rapid intensification? And that's kind of where our technology is going now with computer modeling, is hopefully we can be able to detect the rapid intensification of storms as far out in advance as we possibly can. But as we said, most of the storms, all but one of all the major landfalling hurricanes in the U.S. were only tropical storms 3 days before landfall.
Wow. Yeah. Yeah. And yeah, those are good points. And I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but the way I understand it is sort of projecting ahead. Climate change is sort of predicted to not necessarily cause more storms, although the storms that we do have may be more powerful, I guess, is the idea.
Correct. It may not necessarily mean we get more in any given season, but it may be that the storms that we do see are more of the rapid intensifying or just stronger in nature. There's more moisture associated with them in the atmosphere. And so these have more rainfall. And that's something that is going to probably forever frustrate meteorologists is forecasting the intensity. As I said, that's something that we're getting better at, but it's probably always going to lag behind the track forecast. But on top of the intensity, then the impacts once on land. And that may be something that is near impossible to accurately forecast with these storms. Something that was really interesting with Ida making landfall was that a slight wobble to the east, which for all intents and purposes is near impossible to forecast. When that center of the storm moves over land, where does it wobble? Is it 10 so miles west or east? A few miles to the east of Ida's landfall, as it was moving inland, would have put an additional 3 to 5 feet of storm surge on our West Bank hurricane risk reduction system. So just a slight wobble one way would have intensified the impacts to our levee protection system dramatically. And that little wobble, as even at the time the director of the Hurricane Center, Ken Graham, said, is impossible to forecast. That a wobble one way or another is still an accurate forecast, whether it's 10 miles one way or 10 miles another. That is an accurate forecast for the computer models and the folks at the Hurricane Center. So that little wobble dramatically changes the potential impacts on land. And we know from the geography of the Louisiana coastline, those impacts could mean dramatically different situations for some of the communities that are outside of that levee system or within the levee system, and those that just have marsh right up to the community, those that have maybe a little bit more of a solid land barrier before that storm surge comes in. And so those impacts are going to probably be near impossible to figure out. That's why it's always best to err on the side of caution, as we say each and every season.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Colin, I wanted to give you a chance on this important issue of sheltering, since so much of this falls on cities and parishes. What advice do you give people in terms of shelters in New Orleans? Is there, for this season, does the city have some shelters that they're going to be setting up, or how do you advise people on that?
I think our strategy is definitely changing, and it's changing due to the unpredictability of rapidly intensifying short notice storms. And so what we've developed since Ida is the emergency resource center concept, where we have up to 16 different facilities around the city, mostly NORD rec centers, libraries, and the like, community centers run by the Department of Property Management, that we can set up. My goal is within 12 hours after landfall to have geographically them set up all over. And these are places where you can come in and potentially, especially if we have a longer term power outage, you can come in and get water, ice. We'll have tarps there. We'll have all of those things, plus Wi-Fi, charging devices, the ability to exchange oxygen bottles, batteries for durable medical devices. A lot of these different functions that are unavailable in the immediate aftermath of a hurricane. I think what we have to remember is that evacuation will always be a primary priority for our residents and our visitors in any major hurricane. And what I would consider is a Category 3 or above is a major hurricane that is bearing down on our community. What we don't see is the ability, like Ruby had mentioned, we don't have the ability to have 72 hours to set up a lot of what the plans post-Katrina were built off of. A lot of them were built off of Gustav, which was a storm that came from the Atlantic and was able to, we were able to watch it exponentially rise in intensity, and it never deviated right up until the end, thankfully. It never deviated off of New Orleans. So there was the ability to kind of say, okay, at 96 hours, we're going to do this. 84 hours, we're going to do this. 72 hours, this is when this triggers. We're having to move all of that forward. My goal is I think we can bring some things down to about 48 hours. I'm not talking about state plans, contraflow, those other things, but I think that there's things that we can do that will bring things down to below 48 hours prior to landfall. I still think that that's going to be tough when you're looking at Ida intensified. Chris will get me correct on this, but intensified from a tropical depression to a category 3 within 24 hours, 36 hours at the most. And so, that's a challenge. So that's why I say connection is the most important part. We're going to have the ability to shelter folks, particularly vulnerable populations, if we need to. We've done that in previous storms. We've utilized facilities like the recreation centers. We've used the convention center before for smaller medical sheltering for storms. I think that that's going to be a priority for folks to know that when we do have to do that, we're going to put it out through our media partners like yourselves. We're going to put it out through NOLA Ready, and we're going to give people instructions on what to do. I think the important thing is if you have the ability to evacuate for a major storm and we need to do that, don't wait. Do it. Enact your plan, get your folks and get your people to safety, and we'll go from there. But I think that in the future, and what we want to start really building with our state and federal partners is a larger ability potentially to refuge here should we have to. And then our plans right now are calling for really robust post-storm evacuation should that be necessary. In the instance like Chris is talking about, look, we could see from Ida that, Kenner and areas to our west got absolutely hammered by Ida, particularly the wind event. And, that is not lost on us that although our levee system, I think, is in a far better place than it was in 2004, 2005, it hasn't truly been tested. I think it's been tested to a certain extent over these past 3-4 years with different events, but there is definitely a need for us to look much more strongly at sheltering locally, even though in the past that has not been the preferred method. It's not my preferred method, but given the scenarios that we are in, I think particularly with vulnerable populations, that's what we're going to have to do.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, if I'm remembering correctly, the most deaths from Ida were not actually directly from the storm. It was in New Orleans, at least. It was from the electricity shortages, right?
Right. No, we're seeing that across the board with going back a couple of years now, Laura, Delta, Zeta, and Ida. You're seeing the post-event impacts and injuries and fatalities are far outweigh. People are getting the message about storm surge and about hiding from wind and running from water. What we have to promote more is the safety afterwards with generators. Generators alone, after Laura, killed many people and injured many people. And so generator safety and dealing with heat and heat-related illness post-storm when we're maybe in a condition without power is huge.
Yeah. And I'll just add one thing, because you mentioned the New Orleans levee system, which, yes, is obviously in a much better place now. But even the Corps itself says, look, this is going to be overtopped one day. Hopefully the levees still hold if it's overtopped, but we're going to get overtopping. It's just a question of when.
It's designed for it. It's designed for a certain amount. They're always very clear that it's, and they named it the Hurricane and Storm Damage Risk Reduction System rather than just the levee system, right? And the reason for that is because you can reduce risk, but you can't eliminate risk. and so it will always be there. What I am encouraged by, and I'll say this quite frankly, they saw a problem at the London Avenue Canal with pumps. It's a maintenance design issue, I believe, but they fixed it immediately. And when I say immediately, they, within weeks, they had a workaround done and full capacity back prior to June 1st, and then permanent repairs scheduled for the fall, which I think we can't ask for much more than that. That was very encouraging to me, that they realized, and were able to act very quickly. And I don't think, I think that's the kind of test that I look for as an emergency manager, that we're serious about not getting into the same situation that we were in 2005.
Yeah, and they're still, they've got those temporary repairs in place, but they're still looking for the long-term, investigating the long-term cause of that, which they're
right,
delving into.
right.
So we're getting a little short on time, so I wanted to get into sort of post-storm advice for a few minutes. And Ruby, maybe if you could advise people a little bit on how to respond after. People have had so much trouble sort of getting insurance claims taken care of. FEMA is always, it's always a very complicated bureaucratic process. What are some things you tell people to kind of who may have had damage? Well, first, maybe if you can start with when to return, and then what to do once you do get back.
So it's still very important for folks to still stay in tune with the local weather and ask for local officials, because they'll let you know when those community lifelines have been stabilized for safe return. We definitely don't want folks to kind of return when we still have a lot of debris down, and of course critical infrastructure not being able to maintain supports of life safety, because some people will go and they're not ready and they'll try to get on the rooftop and hurt themselves and those kinds of things. So definitely have a lifeline and pulse line to your local officials, and they're going to make sure exactly when it's safe to return. I'll also tell you, recovery is hard. Response, we want to get people out and get them out of harm's way very fast, but recovery can be a marathon because not everybody has the same kind of resources. And so, first of all, I would tell those folks to be thinking about that, because when we look about the last 3 years, affordable housing is the number one resource that we don't have in Louisiana, even before the storms hit. And so, when we talk about trying to make sure people are in a safe area and possibly may need to relocate, that's not unlikely. The reality of recovery is hard because housing stock does not return unless in almost like 5 to 7 years post disaster. So when you're thinking about recovery, you need to be thinking about maintaining documentation, pictures of houses, what you have, what you don't have. We do have the getagainplan.org app for people to be able to maintain that information. But I also tell folks that if they have insurance, make sure that they get to know that Jake with State Farm is worth more than just khakis. They need to actually consult with their insurance agents to know what's on their declaration statement, what are the limitations, and what their policy covers. You wouldn't believe that the number of people that have loss of use coverage, which the insurance can pay for hotels while they actually are displaced, and they didn't realize they had that in their policy. I also will tell people that they have a misunderstanding when it comes to FEMA, because FEMA, everybody, whether you have insurance or not, you should apply for FEMA. Now, FEMA cannot pay for something that another source is providing you, but it's important for you to maintain those informations to kind of get any kind of recovery assistance that you may be eligible for. That's very important. We know with these past storms that FEMA actually triggered generators for folks. Generators would be a hot commodity, but at least that way you can get reimbursements for generators and chainsaws if you don't have them. So, recovery is really hard. I would definitely make sure that you kind of keep documentation to maintain and also looking at those policies so you can kind of know what you have on hand so you can support your recovery. I will also tell those folks, we noticed that from Laura Delta in Southwest Louisiana and even Southeast Louisiana, there was a big fight and lack of shortage for certified contractors. So maybe go ahead and look and see, and if you had to have restoration to your home, as well as rebuilding or repairing your house, to be also thinking about the contractors that you would contact. So that would kind of give you a jump start, and also make sure you're taking care of your physical health and your mental health. Recovery can be very, very difficult for folks to go through. It's definitely a marathon and not a sprint. So those are some of the quick tips I would definitely stress.
Yeah, that's great advice, Ruby. And just from having covered a lot of post-storm recovery, I would say a couple of things. I would say before you leave, document as much as you can. Maybe even take pictures. That's going to come in handy later. And then when you do get back, beware of contractor fraud. That's a big issue. You might want to even take a picture of the person you hire, and a picture of their license, a picture of their driver's license. Just, there's a lot of fly-by-night people who come in trying to unfortunately take advantage of people in difficult situations. But maybe, Colin, if you could go through post storm, kind of what do you advise people in terms of when to come back, what to do once you get back, especially if you have damage?
Again, I don't want to sound like a broken record, but it's all about connection and staying connected. And we're gonna, we have a tiered reentry system. That's something that we've deployed to other communities after Harvey, Irma, Maria, other Francis, other storms in the recent past that we have deployed for. We have seen in other states that they have tried to model our tiered reentry program that we run in conjunction with the state. And I think that obviously, if you can go to One Stop Shop here for the city of New Orleans on our website, One Stop Shop, and apply for hurricane reentry placards. If you're a business owner, even as a resident, you can. As a resident, you'll be given a tier 3 status, which you can print out from your computer. For higher level or more critical businesses and professions that are out there, essential, if you will, we actually have you come into the office, and we have higher priority placards that will allow people to come in, as soon as we think that it's even remotely safe for business owners and others, particularly utilities, healthcare, banking, pharmacy, in order for them to get back and assess damage. We'll get them in as soon as possible. It's obviously you have to be patient with this process, but I think our reentry system is quite good. What I will say is that what I've talked about with the emergency resource centers and a lot of those things, those are all post-storm projects that, really, as soon as that storm's made landfall, that's when, and Ruby kind of alluded to, it's one of the more difficult aspects of what we do is recovery. We have signed on again this year for the state's trailer program. We think that that's a great ability moving forward. We have certain challenges in New Orleans with trailers, but we recognize that may be a solution for housing for folks that have lost the ability to use their home. Please, for everyone out there, commit to memory damage.la.gov. Damage.la.gov. That is going to be a really crucial asset for our public to document their damage. And what that does is it gets the ball rolling, particularly with the federal side, in determining how much damage is out there to residences, businesses, and to government facilities and buildings. And it gets us towards understanding the number and reaching that kind of threshold that we have with the federal government to start a lot of those programs to get down here as quickly as possible. Recovery programs, not response programs. That's your individual assistance, public assistance. A lot of those different things are determined based on the damage that is assessed out there. And if we can get our residents to get logged on, take some pictures, document that damage. We're networked as a city, all of our public infrastructure. We are integrated with the state to reflect all of that damage that's out there. And we send crews out immediately, different tracks. We have fire department out there looking. We have code enforcement, safety and permits. A lot of these roles, safety and permits and code enforcement, we know we're short on people, but they're not doing their normal permitting process during this time. They're completely committed to disaster work. And so we want to make sure that we're out there and accurately collecting all of the information regarding damage from the storm. So damage.la.gov is going to be a huge resource for the public. And we saw it during Laura, Delta, Zeta, and Ida that's getting us to our number and where we need to be as far as recognized damage very quickly.
Yeah, that's so important. Yeah, damage.la.gov, please. Yeah, document your damage for sure. So maybe we're running out of time. Maybe we can wrap up with Chris. Chris, I think you're from the New Orleans area. You've been through a lot of these types of weather events. Maybe you could just describe, especially for people who haven't been here that long, what are some of your lessons learned, or some of your advice for getting through these kinds of events?
Getting through it is I think erring on the side of caution for everything, and anticipating kind of the worst case scenario. And we've talked about it, Colin and Ruby, about evacuations. Something that we talk about on air, though, is that in some areas, I mean, we cover a large area for Southeast Louisiana and Southern Mississippi, is that for any given storm, not everyone has to evacuate. If there are people that are in a situation where you're not really at risk of flooding. There are parts of Louisiana that maybe not at the greatest risk for flooding, at least from storm surge. Rainfall is a completely different matter. In some areas, especially once we kind of have that track nailed down, and we can really start advising first the folks that need to evacuate where you should go, what direction is probably going to be the safest. If we have kind of that track nailed down, but maybe there's been a little bit of a jog one way or another, we can kind of better advise as to where the evacuations, where you may need to go to stay away from the worst side of the storm. And each storm is different. Something that we always stress every year is that each and every storm structurally is completely different. Some we've seen in the past, and these are not necessarily evacuation type storms, but the center of circulation is closer to Louisiana than the worst of the storms. There may have been dry air that kind of wrapped around the eastern side and actually removed the worst of the storms a few hundred miles off to the east. There was one storm, and I'm blanking as to which one it was. The center of circulation was near the Mississippi coast, Louisiana coast, and the worst thunderstorms were over Panama City Beach. So you can get these storms where structurally we're not actually even in the worst of the storm. So with regards to each storm, treat each one completely different. If you think, hey, I was dry, I stayed home, barely lost power, or didn't lose power for very long in Ida, I think I'm going to ride this next one out. We've heard it. I mean, anybody that's from here, generation after generation of, I rode out this one, I'm going to ride out this one. Each storm is completely different. So if there's any one thing that I would say is a takeaway, especially if you're new to the area, is that just because you didn't flood in X storm doesn't mean you won't flood in Y storm, or my trees withstood this storm, they'll probably be fine in this storm, or my street didn't get any water, it'll be fine in this one. Each storm and their impacts are completely different from storm to storm. And sometimes we always like to go back in history and compare storms. That sometimes that can be a dangerous thing to do with regards to what impacts you think or you assume you're going to see.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's Hurricane Betsy was a long time ago. It was very different, very different circumstances. So yeah, on that we'll wrap it up. I want to thank all three of you for all that great advice. I mean, this was a fantastic panel. You guys are really experts on this stuff. Have been doing this for a while, and I hope people take a lot of that advice to heart. And let's hope for a quiet hurricane season for a second year in a row for us, at least. But as the panelists pointed out, it only takes one, and you really need to be prepared. We've seen it way too often. So thanks again. And please check back to NOLA.com, theadvocate.com for further coverage. And stay tuned to our panelists and local media for all the latest advice. Thank you. Have a good day.